apologies for that, everyone. Had a little bit technical difficulties. So on behalf of the Barbados Museum and Historical Society, I would like to welcome you to the fourth lecture in our 2021 series entitled Fighting for Soul, Religion and Spirituality in Barbados. This evening, Professor Pedro Welch will be talking to us about carrying the gospel to the Ethiopians, Non-Conformist missions to Barbados, 1850 to the 1970s. We will also be joined by Dr. Henderson Carter, who will be chairing the lecture. A reminder of our hosting rules: all comments and conversations must be placed in the chat. Any questions for Professor Welch should be placed in the Q&A at the bottom of your screen. And as a courtesy, all participants will be muted. So now I will hand over things to Dr. Henderson Carter.
Thank you, Mrs. Pinder. A pleasant good evening to all. Welcome to the fourth lecture in this Barbados Museum UWI lecture series on religion and spirituality. I'm Henderson Carter, chair of the Barbados Museum Publications Committee and senior lecturer in history at the UWI Cathedral campus. We are glad that you could join us today for this presentation entitled Carrying the Gospel to the Ethiopians, Non-Conformist Missions to Barbados, 1850s to the 1970s. That will be delivered by Professor Emeritus Pedro Welch. Professor Welch is a retired deputy principal of the University of the West Indies, Cathedral campus, former dean of the Faculty of Humanities and Education, and professor of social and medical history in the Department of History and Philosophy at the UWI. He is the recipient of a number of awards. These include a Commonwealth Scholarship in 1984 and a 1992 Johns Hopkins Fellowship. Professor Welch has written or co-authored several books and articles, including Red and Black over White, Free-Colored Women in Pre-Emancipation Barbados, and that was published in 2000. And of course, his seminal work, Slave Society in the City, Bridgetown, Barbados, 1680 to 1834, that was published in 2003. He has delivered several public addresses in the USA, the UK, France, and Canada, and in several Caribbean countries, as well as in Barbados. Professor Welch is a devoted Christian, a family man, a father, and he's eminently qualified to deliver this, the fourth lecture in the Barbados Museum UWI lecture series. I now invite Professor Welch to deliver his presentation.
Thank you very much, Dr. Carter, my colleague and friend. It is certainly a privilege for me to be part of this series and to speak on this very involved topic. We are here looking at the whole question of the gospel, arrival of the gospel through non-conformist missions to Barbados between 1850 or so and the 1890 and the 1970s. But I want to make it clear that these dates are simply markers that enable us to contextualize the changes that are taking place, particularly after emancipation. The prevailing historical context in Barbados that saw the arrival of various Christian sects in Barbados after emancipation relates firstly to extension of some toleration in Britain to the so-styled dissenting or non-conformist churches, following the passing of what was called the Toleration Act of 1689. That is, despite the dominant position of the Church of England in the political culture of England, there have been some movement towards the guarantee of religious freedom to dissenting religious groups. This included even granting of religious toleration to Jewish settlers in England during what is called the Protectorate and afterwards. And the Protectorate relates to the time when Oliver Cromwell governed England. I want to say ruled England, but that would be a little inaccurate. In the West Indian colonies, it would take a longer time to ensure that these rights, the rights for churches, triumph, particularly given the dominance of the Church of England at the local political level, more so at the level of the vestry. And throughout the Caribbean, wherever the Anglican Church was present, and wherever the British were present, you tend to find that they developed what was called the vestry system. And the church controlled that vestry system. It was another layer of politics in the various Caribbean territories. However, by the post-emancipation period, and going on well into the early 20th century, following the much earlier arrival of the Methodists, the Moravians, the Baptists, and others, the political legal systems in Barbados and the other British West Indian colonies were primed to grant some grudging recognition to various dissenting or non-conformist groups. These include some such as the Seventh-day Adventists, the Gospel Hall Assemblies, the Christian Mission, the New Testament Church of God, the African Methodist Episcopal Church, that's the AME Church, the Pilgrim Holiness, and I say Allah Wesleyan Holiness because the name changed over time, the Salvation Army, the Bethany Christian Church, and later the First Church of Christ Scientists, the Church of the Nazarene, the Jehovah's Witnesses, and various Pentecostal groups which arrived in Barbados. The other groups, other than these that I've just listed, who will not be found in any official listing of churches in Barbados and elsewhere in the British Caribbean, but they fit broadly into the movements represented by the church we have listed. Thus, we will find several small groups who meet in churches broadly described in Barbados as missions. These are generally non-denominational in their affiliation, led by a charismatic individual, but in their theological practice, these can be seen to belong, however loosely, to the theological traditions of the larger, officially registered churches. There were individuals such as Brother Lally, who had what might be described as an itinerant ministry, and Sister Esterbrook or Easterbrook. Another group that may trace its arrival in Barbados back to the late 19th and early 20th centuries, including the so-called tent gathering. That's one of those groups that will not be listed anywhere, but it's very much a part of the Barbadian landscape. But our identification identifies this group, this tent gathering, as emerging out of a religious group that began in England around 1897. We'll hear a bit more about that. However, in chronicling the arrival and growth of these groups in Barbados and the wider Caribbean, very relevant, we might note that there's generally a dearth of academic publishing on their historical development in the island. In that case, as an important aside, we mention a few of the authors whose work has been invaluable in this presentation. Firstly, let me mention the work by Oakling Hendricks, and a Jamaican AME minister who authored the work, The African Methodist Episcopal Church in Barbados, 1892 to 1980. This is published in a series edited by Professor Cartwright Davis, a well-known theologian and academic, and it began its life as a research paper at Covington College. Another contribution to our presentation this evening is the book authored by Professor Emeritus Glenn Phillips, formerly of Morgan State University in the United States of America. And that book is titled Seventh-day Adventists in Barbados, Over a Century of Adventism, 1884 to 1991. This publication was commissioned by the East Caribbean Conference of Seventh-day Adventists and published in 1991 in commemoration of the centennial of the official founding of the Seventh-day Adventist Church in Barbados. A third book used in my presentation is that authored by Sylvan Catwell, an elder of the Gospel Hall Assemblies in Barbados. and is published in 1995. It is entitled The Brethren in Barbados, Gospel Hall Assemblies, 1889 to 1994. A fourth source is a book authored by Dr. Henderson Carter and published in 2008. This is entitled Molding Communities, Touching Lives, A History of the Church of the Nazarene in Barbados, 1926 to 2008. Yet another useful source is a research paper prepared by Mary Farley for academic year 1991-92 at the University of the West Indies, and entitled The Growth and Development of the Christian Mission in Barbados, 1969 to 1990. It is known that three of these works cover the history of the various churches from their original emergence in Barbados over 100 years ago. And the fourth one covers a period almost 100 years ago, while the fifth one is a more recent vintage. It will seem then that the time is ripe for a comprehensive historical text on the dissenting churches in Barbados, including these and many others that dot our island's landscape. Against this background, then, we return to our historical narrative, noting that a second historical context that facilitated the arrival of such groups in Barbados has to do with the far-reaching changes that were taking place in global communications as industrial development began to shape the socio-economic, political, and cultural landscape in the United States and in Britain. Thus, in the post-emancipation period under survey, particularly from the 1850s into the early 20th century, we witnessed the spread from Great Britain and the United States of America and Europe generally to the West Indian colonies of new modes of communication and international contact that facilitated the spread of dogma and ideas that laid the foundation for the spread of new modes of the Christian faith in the colonial world. In order to develop this theme, we know that in the Barbadian context, it is remarkable that some of the new technologies being developed in Europe arrived in the island, in some cases less than 20 years after their first applications in Europe or North America. Thus, in an extract from the Times newspaper of Wednesday, October 21st, 1780, which quoted a European publication, we read thus: in a special from the European Mail, its readers in the West Indies are congratulated on the inauguration of the telegraph line. So we're talking about major technological developments which are facilitating the movement of people and of ideas throughout the region. Certainly, if one takes note of legislation passed between the 1860s and the 1870s, it is pretty clear that Barbadian officials were hard at work in paving the way for an improved communications network between the island and Europe and North America and then through the region. You have another act in 1869, not only which talks about the electric telegraph, but the connection of the continents of Europe and America by the International Ocean Telegraph Company. All of this activity on the legislative front marked the Barbadian Enlightenment. That is, in an island but only recently released from the cruelty and backwardness of a slave society, we are witnessing the rapid integration of the island into the technological, social, and development of a global society. It's not surprising then that Glenn Phillips's article on the visit of a Judge Straker to Barbados in 1895 reports that the judge had observed, and I'm going to quote it for you, more significant steps towards the modernization of Bridgetown and the island were evident in the existence of the telegraph and the telephone services introduced in 1872 and 1882 respectively, both of which allowed Barbados to participate more effectively and efficiently in the international market of the 1890s. Straker had been born in Barbados and had migrated to the USA in the 1860s, and he was well placed to tell us what was happening in Barbados. These technological developments were clearly consolidating the place of the island in the international communications network. Again, the point is not just the the fact that there was a rapid movement of goods and services, but also that there was a facility which will enable people to spread ideas and to establish contacts with people outside of the island. We also note that by 1899, we are anticipating the flooding of light in Barbados. And that is not an insignificant observation. And this is the beginning, only the beginning. In the 1890s, we are still in the time of the kerosene oil lamp, the smart lamp, and all of this. And the darkness of rural Barbados provided an atmosphere, an environment in which things were considered as living in the night. Thus, in Barbados, the nights were occupied by tails of hags and steel donkeys and duppies. They were imported also from our neighbors other terms, so that Barbados referred to larger bless or larger bless, which really is a corruption of larger bless, female devil. Notwithstanding some elements of communication, however, the spectacular technological development that is taking place in the island was facilitating the communication of a Christian message from sources that were not hitherto part of the cultural heritage of the island. If the Christian message could be spread via the electronic media of the time, it could also be transported by bodies, as by people, as others outside of the island community and those who live within the island's cultural ambit could move physically, primarily by steamship and sailing ships to and from the island. The following table is a volume of shipping that is moved through the island. There's a table that covers the period from, excuse me, from 1909 to 1925, no, well, to 1938. And we find that you have 142 ships visit the island in 1912, 151 in 1909, 141 in 1913, 185. And that's the kind of figures that you're getting. In 1937, you have the 110, 109. And so there are a tremendous amount of slides which we have access to that speak about the rapid development of communications in Barbados. Incidentally, not only do we have figures about shipping, but we also have the development of steamship companies, which see Barbados as an entrepot in their services towards the region and beyond. So that here you have a situation where you have a series of advertisements, and that's coming up in another slide that follows. And those advertisements speak about the certain steamship lines. One shouts loudly, shipping, seamen, passengers, and tourists. And it talks about the principal lines of steamships calling at this port, that's Bridgetown, from the United Kingdom and European ports. You have the Fifes line, and the Harrison line, and the Leyland line, and the Royal Netherlands Steamship Company, the Hamburg America line. And from Canada, the Canadian National Steamships, the Ocean and Development line. There are also, from the United States of America, the Bermuda West Indies Steamship Company. You have from South America, the Booth line. In other words, what I'm really saying to us, the next slide also shows a continuation of these things, that they will make regular monthly calls. And what we're really saying here is that if you're going to understand how some of these groups came to be in Barbados after emancipation, we have to begin to understand that we're dealing with a period of tremendous technological and cultural change. The technology relates to the whole question that I pointed out earlier of shipping. We're not yet at the era of the airplane. That comes a little later. But certainly at this period, Barbados is a place where many, many ships visit every month. And they come from all over the region, from all over the world. I recall that there was a Brazilian composer, I think it's Villalobos, who came to Barbados by ship and spent a few months here and composed one of his musical scores in Barbados. I think it's called the Barbados Girl. So these are all representations of what was happening. And I'm saying this is connected to the movement of people, because in the same way that tourists were coming, in the same way that businessmen were coming to Barbados and people moving from Barbados elsewhere, churchmen, church women were also coming to Barbados, were also moving here, and were also bringing their message to Barbados. So having identified the techno-industrial changes that were taking place in the wider metropolitan and colonial world, as well as in Barbados during the late 19th century into the 20th century, and noting how these facilitated the flow of people and ideas both from and to Barbados, we now turn our attention to other impactful events more directly related to the arrival of various dissenting groups in Barbados during the survey period. And we are looking specifically at three great periods in the history of the church in the Western world. And these periods are called the periods of the First Great Awakening, the Second Great Awakening, and the Third Great Awakening. In the First Great Awakening, with the passing of the early Puritan pioneers and pilgrims, the religious fervor of the migrants to America waned as they got on with the business of capitalist accumulation. Moreover, an intense period of cultural and philosophical change had begun to sweep Europe, and by extension, the colonies of the New World, including Barbados. This period of change was known as the Enlightenment, and its emphasis on philosophical rationalism also impacted on the Christian communities, both in Europe and the New World. Alarmed at the falling away from primitive Christianity, by which we mean from a Christianity which was a purer form, so some of the theologians at the time felt, theologians began to launch an attack on the growing secularism that they saw was engulfing their congregations. And they launched an attack on some of these movements, these secularist movements. Some of these, like a man called Theodore Friedel-Hussein, a minister of the Dutch Reformed Church, pointed to a lack of personal piety among the clergy as being a root cause of the malaise that swept New World Christendom. And he dedicated himself to the promotion of reform in his church. So from the 1730s to the 1760s, a great revival movement led by some theologians began to sweep the countries in Europe and North America. Another prominent person associated with this period of reform is a man called George Whitefield. He was an Anglican minister, but he had a great admiration for the teaching of John and Charles Wesley, and it led him to identify with the Methodists. During this period, you also find the spread of the Moravian and the Methodist churches to Barbados, and we also find the arrival of the Baptist church in Jamaica. And this is part of that First Great Awakening. The Second Great Awakening period is from during the 1790s into the 1840s. And there's a revival of Christian faith and witness in United States of America and elsewhere. What we have then is that new denominations are emerging. In North America, you find ministers traveling on horseback to remote locations. And among the groups that emerge in this particular period, we identify the Adventist movement. And let me be clear here. There was a movement before the emergence of the Seventh-day Adventist Church called the Advent movement, or the awakening of the Adventists. That was in the 1830s to 1840s. That first period, persons were looking for the coming of Jesus Christ. And it is out of that movement that later, when Christ did not come, a group of persons studying the Bible decided that a major mistake had been made, and after further Bible study, they coalesced into the beliefs that became known as the Seventh-day Adventist Church. But there was an Adventist group at that time. We also have a group known as the Latter-day Saints, known to us as today as the Mormon Church. And we had a movement we call dispensationalism. These are all part of the Second Great Awakening. And the Third Great Awakening identifies a period from the late 1850s into the early 20th century. During this period, several Christian groups advanced a return to the pious lifestyles that were expected to be informed by the primitive Christianity of the New Testament church. Some elements of this movement involved the promulgation of a social gospel and an emphasis on organized missionary activity to save men and women, boys and girls from a sinful world. Groupings that emerged in this period included the several elements of what was termed as the Holiness movement, the Nazarene and Pentecostal movements, the Jehovah's Witnesses, the Church of God, the 2x2 movement, of which you have already made some brief mention. And you may also include the Salvation Army in this mix of new groupings. So now we have identified the three main historical elements in the post-emancipation period, and certainly we've identified these historical elements in the background of the dissenting groups that come to Barbados. We're going to spend some time now in looking at some of these groups that arrived in Barbados in some greater detail. So we need to recall, just by way of summary, that we have technological development taking place in Barbados and throughout the world, and also certainly throughout the Caribbean. That technological development is facilitating the spread of ideas and people. And what we are saying is that in addition to that, you have a big set of cultural changes taking place in Europe and North America. And we have classified those under the titles of the First Great Awakening, the Second Great Awakening, the Third Great Awakening. Now, out of this, we begin to see the movers into the region of groups that we call the non-conformist and dissenting churches. Incidentally, the non-conformist is a term that's used to refer primarily to churches that did not belong to the social and political and cultural establishment that might have been led by the Church of England before. In England, there were many earlier non-conformist groups. You have the Baptists came out of a non-conformist background. Moravians can be considered non-conformists. Methodists. There's some other groups too. The Puritans were, Puritan groups in England were non-conformists. But the newer groups that we're talking about, which came to Barbados in the late 19th century, that's another wave of Christian groups which are emerging after, particularly during the Second and the Third Great Awakenings. And the first group that we're going to be looking at is the group known as the Seventh-day Adventist Church. Now, you'll see a slide, the sequential arrival, and the only reason for the word sequential there is that we're looking really at these groups more so in order of the chronology of their arrival. There are other groups which are circulating, but these are the major ones. The narrative of the Seventh-day Adventist Church in Barbados and the wider Eastern Caribbean and the Guyanas has been retold several times in the various heritage publications of the church. However, a relatively truncated summary is appropriate here. Typically, the launch of an Adventist presence in Barbados is tied to the widespread distribution of the church's literature through the International Tract Society. And again, I'm drawing attention to the fact that there's a tremendous development in the area of communications. And I hadn't told you before, but I'm telling you now that one of those areas of development has to do with the postal system. So right here in Barbados, there's a rival here in Barbados of the literature coming from churches such as the Seventh-day Adventists. This International Tract Society, which sent out literature from the church, was started about 1874, and it began its life as a General Conference Tract and Missionary Society, but then became the ITS, the International Tract Society, in 1882. In 1901, it was styled as the Home Missionary Department of the General Conference. We are particularly fortunate that under the latter designation, that is the Home Missionary Department, a church periodical titled The Home Missionary has made available to researchers hundreds, if not thousands, of documents detailing the history of the various mission fields. As the contemporary narratives detail, in 1883, Captain William Boynton of the ITC, or rather William Boynton of the ITC, succeeded in persuading the captain of a ship trading to the Guianas and the Caribbean to distribute some SDA literature on his arrival in the Caribbean. As George Enoch, one of the pioneer missionaries to the Caribbean, informs us, this captain had simply dropped his packages on the wharf side in British Guiana, no Guyana. Fortuitously, as far as the church is concerned, a copy of one magazine from the church called The Signs of the Times was retrieved from the bundle by an old man who related his find to a lady who visited him to inquire after his health. Subsequently, she sent a copy of the Adventist literature to her sister, Anna Aline of St. Philip, Barbados. She began to accept the message as she read in these magazines and began Saturday Sabbath observance. To return to the role of literature distribution in the entry of Adventism into the island and region, the nucleus of the church membership in Barbados may be traced to the group, including Anna Aline, who were apparently meeting in St. Philip Parish. However, as we have already noted, while their conversion might be directly traced to the arrival of correspondence from British Guyana or Guyana, the well-organized postal system in Barbados, possibly the best in the region, and the excellent steamer and schooner connections to South and North America facilitated a flow of literature from the ITS. In 1890, when the first ordained Adventist missionary to the island, Dexter Ball, arrived, and another person called a literature evangelist or colporteur, when they arrived, the voluminous correspondence which was exchanged between the ITS and the residents of the island clearly pointed to a previous contact with them even before the connection between British Guiana and Barbados. We had a letter, for example, in 1890 from the secretary of the Young Men's Christian Association, YMCA in Barbados. And he writes, and he's writing to the ITS, the Adventist publishers, I have to thank your society very much for forwarding to our association a package of your publications, which were very much appreciated. We shall be very much pleased indeed to receive further supplies. Now, of course, the YMCA was connected with the Anglican Church, and this correspondence unbridled enthusiasm for getting more literature illustrates the extraordinary impact that the ITS was having on the Barbadian population. Equally enthusiastic was a letter from the minister of religion, possibly of the Anglican or even the Methodist persuasion. He writes, I embrace this hurried opportunity of thanking you for this very interesting literature sent me from time to time. I must acknowledge that not only myself, but others have benefited by it. I find that new light has been communicated to me. Remarkably, this cleric enclosed a list of 6 persons who he opined, quote, would like to receive some of the same literature. A rather fascinating story of the arrival of the Seventh-day Adventist Church and how the ministers of religion in Barbados who are seeing this literature for the first time and in fact are acting to facilitate its spread. Next slide, please. And now we have a situation here where we're talking about 1899, about 66 persons in the church in Barbados. That's the beginning of the Seventh-day Adventist group in Barbados. Beginning around 1890, officially, although there's some evidence of contact with them, with the Adventist Church before. The next group that we're going to look at now is the Christian Mission Church. The Christian Mission Church, what we know about them now is that they have about 20 congregations covering the length and breadth of Barbados. What is not generally known is that the origins of this group in Barbados, like that of the Seventh-day Adventist Church, dates back to the 1890s. Apparently, a Barbadian migrant to the United States of America is identified as an S.H. Bailey, disillusioned by the alleged failure of the Methodist Church to support a greater emphasis on divine healing, severed his connection with that church. Later, he, that is S.H. Bailey, and a D.A. Ross of St. Kitts agitated for a missionary outreach to the Caribbean. Two of those who responded to the call, Brother George R. Penny and Sister I.D. Haynes, along with a few others, journeyed to Barbados in 1890, and thus began the evangelistic efforts that led to the formation of the Christian Mission Church in the island. Dr. Joan Francis of Washington Adventist University notes, paradoxically, that though her grandparents were converted to Adventism in the 1920s, their religious journey began with a move from the Anglican Church to the Christian Mission. As she informs us, however, in the early 20s, they joined the Christian Mission Church. And she writes about the Christian Mission Church at that time. This church, indigenous to Barbados, was formed in 1890. And with Barbadians who immigrated to Guyana, Panama, and New York. The simplicity of doctrine advocated by the Christian Mission in the island of Barbados may be reduced to the fundamental statement of a belief in the saving power of the blood of Jesus. Few were the rituals, and there existed no hierarchy of offices as in the other Protestant churches. Moreover, we might also note that the ministers who served the Christian Mission were those who felt called to the ministry. There was nothing strange about this type of leadership. It produced results, converts to the kingdom of God, because the men so called to service were induced with the spirit of service and not out of professionalism. In other words, these were not the same men trained in the elite theological seminaries, but they were persons who simply felt a call. John Francis's observation that the Christian Mission were indigenous to Barbados helps to explain why, after an exhaustive search, I could not find any online records detailing the origins as I could for all of the other denominations. However, in order to understand how this group emerges without any formal organizational ties to the old world churches, it is useful to say as part of the continuing ethos of emancipation. That is the organization of homegrown churches outside of the control of the established Church of England and its Episcopal structures was a statement of repudiation of some elements of colonial domination. That is, when we look at the Christian Mission, and we also look at the emergence of some local churches with a single leader, such as the church started by Tom Barker in Ocean View Road in Spooner Hills, and Mrs. Bay's mission in Mayor's Road, Government Hill. When we look at these churches, we see evidence of a coming of age of Afro-Barbadians, determined to know no other master than King Jesus. Some, as in the case of Tom Barker's church, have grown and affiliated themselves as his did, becoming the Shalem Evangelical Church of Bashal. Many of the smaller missions have, however, disappeared, often with the passing of an evangelist. Unlike the local missions, however, the Christian Mission acquired a corporate status, confident enough to give birth to daughter churches elsewhere in the Caribbean. Thus, the Barbadian migrants to Panama took with them their background in the Christian Mission Church and built their own Christian Mission Church in the new land. In that case, the building that you're seeing on the screen which now serves as a museum celebrating the contribution of Afro-West Indians to the development of Panama. That building is, in fact, the original building, and this is a picture dating back to 1910. And the picture here is a testament to the resilience of the Christian mission ethos in a new environment. There are other Christian mission churches in Panama that claim allegiance to the mother church in Barbados. An online comment serves to introduce us to this Panamanian icon of the church. We are told, quote, "The West Indian history is kept alive in part by the Afro-Caribbean Museum. The museum is housed in what was formerly the Christian Mission Church, which was built in El Marañón, Caledonia, by Barbadian workers in the year 1910. It is a wooden structure that reflects a Caribbean style of agriculture, of architecture." The next slide that we would also show the same building, but this time now that's the same building, a little bit more modernized, but that is where the museum is housed, which provides a lot of information on the Afro-Caribbean contribution to Panamanian society. In the Christian Mission Church, as I point out, we may argue that it's of Barbadian extraction. It becomes incorporated in the year 1909 in Barbados. And it's really remarkable that from its incorporation in Barbados in 1909, it was also building a church in Panama in 1910. And in that act of incorporation, and it reads, part of it reads, "Whereas the persons hereinafter named and other persons, inhabitants of this island, have become associated together under the name of the Christian Mission for the purpose of preaching the gospel in its fullness in the West Indies and South America." And then it goes on to say elsewhere of promoting evangelical, domestic, and foreign missions. Like all other religious groups in the island, the Christian Mission Church has not been immune to dissension and schism in its ranks. A local ditty was sung sometime in the 1950s. And I've only been able to get some fragments. And my wife is the person I have to credit with giving me this ditty. And I will not sing it. I will not make the attempt to sing it here on the virtual land. But it says, "Tell Brother Penny to ask Sister Haynes to bring back my jewelry and gold watch and chain. For the Lion of Judah will break every chain and give us the victory again and again." The ditty ended with a statement, "Give me those keys, Brother Bruce, give me those keys." And it relates to a time when there's some schism within the church. And two of the names listed in the Act of Incorporation were that of Brother George Richmond Penny, and Joseph Archibald Bruce. And I believe that this offers some credibility to the names that I mentioned in the ditty. In the late 1950s and into the 60s, another serious fracture occurred when divisions arose between rival factions, led respectively by an elder Frederick Howell and an elder Thomas Laria. It appears that the division was less due to doctrinal differences than to differences over the style of administration practiced by each party. Reportedly, in 1969, the breach was healed and a reunion took place, thereby strengthening the Christian Mission Church in its public image and its evangelistic thrust. Here is a church which is alleged to have had its origins, its emergence in Barbados. It was a homegrown movement which spread across the other areas of the Caribbean, to Panama, also, I understand, to British Guyana, Guyana. It is a story that deserves to be expanded and told. The next church, the next group that I am looking at, we're looking at today is the Salvation Army. It's another religious group that's included in our presentation because it comes out of that great awakening, what is happening in Britain, the change that's taking place within the church culture in England and elsewhere. It owes its origin, as many of us know, to William Booth, who began a mission to underserved groups in London sometime around 1865. His target population was largely drawn from those who were not always welcome into other churches. The poor, thieves, gamblers, drunkards, prostitutes were among the first converts to this new ministry. I'm not suggesting, by definition, that after people get in church, they're not still poor. I'm not suggesting that they're not people who are still gambling when they come into church. But I'm just making the point that as far as Booth was concerned, these are the kinds of persons that the church ought to be reaching out towards. Booth died in 1912, but his wife, Catherine Booth, and his daughter, Eva Corey Booth, were vital in the spread of the Salvation Army's message. Booth saw his group, his church, if you call it that, as being an army sent by God to rescue men, women, and children from worldly vices. In America, his daughter, Eva Corey Booth, better known as Evangeline Booth, was so successful that she was named as the 4th general of the Salvation Army because they carried military ranks in the army. It holds much in common with mainstream Christian denominations, but reportedly does not celebrate the sacraments of baptism and Holy Communion, but it leaves its members free to take part in Holy Communion in any other church if they so desire, and if the other church permits. The actual arrival of the Salvation Army now in the Caribbean really dates back to about 1887, when it formally organized its work in Jamaica. By 1895, it had spread its presence to British Guyana, and by 1898, it had begun an organized work in Barbados. It has therefore been present in this island for over 120 years. It is not clear when the first contact was made by the army in Barbados. However, when the Salvation Army was incorporated in the island of Barbados in April 20, 1917, the Articles of Incorporation declared inter alia, whereas the said William Booth in his lifetime acquired real property in Barbados for the purposes of the Salvation Army, which real property was conveyed to and vested in the said William Booth, and also acquired certain personal property, and is now desirable to provide for the vesting of the said real and personal property in the present and future generals for the time being of a Salvation Army. That's what some of the articles, the preamble states. It shows us, it suggests that there had been a purposeful attempt by Booth to extend the army to Barbados, the Salvation Army. And so therefore, it seems as though he had bought land in Barbados and in his own name. At the time of the incorporation, the petitioner, identified by the Barbados House of Assembly, was a man called William James Matchett, and who was the officer in charge of the army in Barbados. It is not clear if Matchett was the pioneer missionary who had been sent to Barbados. However, from these early beginnings, the Salvation Army has become a respected part of the island's denominational landscape, with 7 settled locations and a number of social welfare sites. Again, at certain times of the year, the Salvation Army's collection for the poor and the indigent and others is a well-known site in Barbados. Having looked at another group which comes into Barbados in the late 19th century, we now look at another group, and that is the Gospel Hall Assemblies. That's the one, that's the next one. The group traces its beginnings back to about 1889. However, a closer look at their origins reveals that they may be traced to a missionary effort by the representative of a Brethren sect. And I'll make note of that name, Brethren, because that is a particularly important aspect of the history of this group. This sect arrived in Barbados probably around 1860. In this case, as Sylvan Capwell tells us, the missionary who arrived was a Benjamin Slims of England. He launched a vigorous evangelistic effort that quickly led to the conversion of several Barbadians to the teachings of the Brethren. However, in Britain, a split occurred in the ranks of the Brethren, with one group identified as the Plymouth Brethren or the Open Brethren, and another called the Exclusives. Apparently, Sims did all that he could to keep the news of the split from the Barbadian worshippers. In any case, his efforts only worked for a while. Thus, in the early 1890s, following the arrival of a missionary from the exclusive group in England named Roland Edwards, a split also occurred in Barbados, with some members aligning themselves with Edwards and thus with the exclusives, and others aligning themselves with Slims and therefore with the Open or Plymouth Brethren. These latter were also sometimes associated with a faction from England that had become associated with a man called William Kelly. Kelly was more liberal in his views than adherents of the exclusive group, and he sanctioned some cooperation with persons from other denominations. In Barbados, the division between the exclusives and the others gave rise to a group we now know, known to all in Central and Barbados as the Closed Brethren. So we have Closed Brethren and other brethren groups, but they have the same common origin. The Gospel Hall Assemblies that we're looking at emerged out of the more open groups. In the 1880s, just before the split came, a female missionary, C. Anne Huntley, arrived in Barbados from British Guiana. She had close associates with a brethren group that was begun by a man called Reverend Leonard Strong. That's in Guyana. He had been a member of the Church of England, that's Reverend Strong, but had been expelled from that church after several disagreements with the hierarchy of the British Guiana diocese. He then started his own brethren group in British Guiana, and he must be credited with the beginning of a brethren ministry in the region as well. After Anne Huntley's visit and sojourn in Barbados, she requested that missionaries be sent from British Guiana. And it's from these visits that we may date the beginning of the Gospel Hall Assemblies. There's a chart which I think we might have in our screen here, which identifies the various Gospel Hall Assemblies in Barbados, and the earlier ones up to the 1960s. And you'll see that the earlier assembly was in St. Elizabeth, Parish of St. Joseph, 1889. Then we had one in Bed Plain, Medford Hill, and others, right up to the 1950s. And then some of these, of course, still exist. And thus, the continued existence of the Gospel Hall Assemblies in Barbados up to our own contemporary period in 2021 is testimony to the effectiveness of the missionary activity carried out by Huntley and others and those who followed them. And we assume that those who are members of the church are particularly proud of their resilience and their continued existence. That is the Gospel Hall. And now we move to another group in Barbados, and we're looking at the African Methodist Episcopal Church. While the African Methodist Episcopal Church is currently one of the lesser known churches in Barbados, its origins precede most of the other non-conformist churches in the island. Often known by the acronym AME, it may be considered as the first Protestant denomination to be founded by Blacks in the New World, Afro-Americans. Its main founder was the Right Reverend Richard Allen, who had been a member of the Methodist Church in the USA and who had left that church along with some others of his fellows as a protest against racial discrimination that they suffered. His theology mirrored that of the Methodist Church from which it emerged, but its emphasis on the rights of Africans in a racist American society marks its distinctiveness as a church. Allen became its first bishop That's why we call him the Right Reverend. And it became his first bishop in 1816. And it's from these early beginnings that the AME Church grew to become one of the largest African-led churches in North America. Its arrival in Barbados was at the instigation of members of the AME Church in Bermuda. The Bermudan group sent a Barbadian, the Reverend C.H. Prescott, to evangelize in Barbados in 1892. However, the competition from other denominations and a failure to attract any converts discouraged his first venture. Prescott returned to Bermuda disappointed. He was followed by a Bermudan minister, the Reverend G. Shepherd, who, like his predecessor, also gave up in frustration. A third missionary, Reverend Reuben Seeley, a Barbadian, I believe living also in Bermuda, or well, the USA, who had become connected with the AME Church. He was sent to in 1893. And this time he was successful in gathering enough converts to require the renting of a hall to accommodate the group. Eventually, he secured a piece of land as a gift from the Pioneers Estate, Pioneers Plantation. And he undertook to build a church, only to see the partially completed building destroyed by a hurricane of 1893. By 1899, he and his group had succeeded in constructing a new building along with the school building. I believe that that building still remains in the Cullen Rock area. The dedication of the church on August 20th, 1899 marked a new phase in the work of this church in Barbados. Seeley died in 1916 after achieving his primary objectives. Between that year and the 1980s, the church had a succession of ministers who labored with varying degrees of success to keep the flock intact. Unfortunately, the AME Church has never acquired major influence in Barbados, managing to have a membership of just about 200 in the 1980s, most of whom were in their over 40s. My understanding is that some more recent ministers have made attempts to revitalize the church. But the fact remains that this is also one of those groups that arrived in Barbados, and its arrival is facilitated by the spread of ideas and people in this particular period. We now turn our attention to the Holiness movement and its legacy. And we would note that there's a Holiness movement that begins in America in particular, and it begins around the time of the Third Great Awakening. Several groups have emerged out of that movement in Barbados. Among these several groups, we may list the Nazarenes, the Church of God, the Reverend Holiness Church, or Pilgrim Holiness Church. We may also note the existence of the United Holy Church of America branches in Barbados, which date back to the 1940s. We shall look more specifically at the larger of these various groups, but you may take a brief look at the work of Bishop Harry Townsend Gentles, who in 1949 founded what is called the Mount Olive United Holy Church. For many Barbadians, this group was simply known as Gentles Church. Apparently, Gentles' evangelistic efforts were preceded by those of a Rosa B. Hawkins of San Francisco. She managed to pioneer the development of 5 churches in Barbados under the Holiness Church banner. These, however, were lost to Pentecostal groups that emerged in the island. It seems, however, that Gentles managed to rescue the remnants of that earlier effort. And one of the features of the United Holy Church of America is the prominent part played by women in the movement. Indeed, Gentles' wife played a major role in the superintendence of this group in Barbados, and after his death, she continued to play a major role in its continuance. Of the other groups that may loosely be seen as arising out of the Holiness movement, we now turn firstly to the Wesleyan or Pilgrim Holiness Church. This church, the Wesleyan Holiness Church, which traces its background again back to the same roots that brought the Christian mission into being Emerging out of the Holiness movement of the USA, there were several evangelistic missions that ministered to the Caribbean. One missionary who arrived in Barbados about 1902 was Reverend C.O. Moulton. He was quickly recognized by George Penny of the Christian Mission as a kindred spirit. And in fact, Penny wanted to groom him as a successor minister to himself. In any case, Moulton left Barbados for British Guiana, and that put paid to any hopes that he would succeed Penny. Following Moulton's departure, a Reverend James Taylor arrived in Barbados with a missionary party and launched several meetings which attracted hundreds of converts. In 1910, Taylor left Barbados for the USA after organizing the believers in what was then called the Faith and Love Mission. Firmly grounded in the tenets of the Holiness movement, the believers persevered until Taylor's return in 1912, following which she and other missionaries organized the believers under the banner of the Apostolic Holiness Church. Over the next few years, other ministers came to shepherd the flock, including Reverends Finch, Tucker, and Burns. In 1917, this new Barbadian group bought land in White Park Road to construct a church building, and it is from this location that the work spread out over the island in the following decades. In 1922, the name of the group was changed from the Apostolic Holiness Church to the Pilgrim Holiness Church, under which name most Barbadians knew of the existence of a church from that period into the 1960s. On May the 31st, 1933, the Pilgrim Holiness Church was incorporated in an act entitled the Pilgrim Holiness Act. The desire of the leadership in Barbados is captured in the preamble to the Incorporation Act, which read, whereas Seth Cook reads and identifies some of the founding members, Reuben Wingrove, Ira Lewis, Sinclair Braffett, Joseph Arimathea Boyce, James William Humphrey, George William Linton, Hezekiah Adolphus Phillips, and others, all members of the Pilgrim Holiness Church in this island, which church has been established for the purpose of teaching and preaching the Christian religion, consider that the work could be carried on to far greater advantage if they are incorporated. Thus, the act of incorporation represents a coming of age of this group. In 1968, after a merger of the parent body in the USA with the Wesleyan Methodist Church, it became known as the Wesleyan Holiness Church, moving from the Pilgrim Holiness title to Wesleyan Holiness. If you pass White Park Road, and you'll see the church here, and you'll see it has two signs on it. One sign says Pilgrim Holiness Church, the other sign says Wesleyan Holiness Church. Today, it's a respected and integral Christian group in the Barbadian landscape. The next church I thought that I deal with now, and I know that we have been here for some time, but I am moving through as rapidly as I can, is the Church of the Nazarene. And I'm grateful to Dr. Henderson Carter for the magnificent work which he's done on the life of this church in Barbados. Most Christians recognize that the term Nazarene, as derived from Holy Writ, is a wide reference to a person born in Nazareth. However, it is often a fond reference to the Lord Jesus Christ himself. In this latter context, the arrival of the group known as the Church of Nazarene in Barbados will be viewed as an attempt to restore what might be termed primitive Christianity to the Christian mission to the unsaved. We are indebted to Dr. Henderson's Carter's research, and it is perhaps one of the best treatments of a dissenting group in Barbadian and Caribbean historiography. From this research, we note that the church emerged around 1908, following a merger of two holiness groups, and it adopted the name the Pentecostal Church of the Nazarene. Two individuals who were selected to superintend the new gathering were Reverend Phineas Breesy and J.P. Whitney. Dr. Carter notes the views of the founders of the church and says the Church of the Nazarene is a simple, primitive church. The church of the people and for the people. It has no new doctrine, only the old Bible truths. It seeks to discard all lowest forms of ecclesiasticism, and to go back to the simple, plain words of Christ. A few years after the formation of the church, the leaders sent out missionaries to various venues. So in 1926, an official, J.I. Hill, arrived in Barbados. And his arrival was due to the missionary spirit which activated the founders. Of equal importance in this missionary outreach was the influence of some Barbadian migrants to New York, who had also formed a branch of the church in their state. And these Barbadians had collaborated in privately funding a Barbadian pioneer, Carlotta Graham, who was working in the island since 1990. Hill was, this man, J.I. Hill, was aware of the pioneer efforts of Graham. And it appears that shortly before he arrived in Barbados, there were some 6 churches that were organized under the Holiness banner and had grouped themselves under the name Nazarene. Hill played an important part in bringing these churches under the organizational control of the Nazarene Mother Church. But in the 1930s, there were some 70 church groups in the Nazarene Church, each with a pastor, and including some female pastors. After Hill's departure in 1939, the new Nazarene Church faced some challenge of secession by some of the associate churches. In any case, at each phase in the growth of a new church, new leadership emerged to take the church forward. Thus, in 1971, the self-confidence of the church is evidenced in the appointment of the first Barbadian to head the church, Reverend Clyde Greenwich, as superintendent of the Barbados branch of the Church of Nazarene. The coming of age of the church undergirds its continued expansion and growth in the island. We'll permit Dr. Carter to write the last word in my summary. And he says, after 82 years of ministry in Barbados, the Church of the Nazarene is still a flourishing, vibrant, and progressive organization on the move for Christ. And I would say I agree with you, Dr. Carter, on that assessment. And now we're coming ready to the last lap. Just a couple of more groups ago, the New Testament Church of God. This dates back to in Barbados 1917, but we know that the church started in the USA in around 1886. Apparently, the church arrives in Barbados in 1917, and we are told that in that period, there were already 4 churches and 80 members in Barbados, but some of that detail has been lost. In any case, I am very fortunate to have had an eyewitness report from the minister who established one of the churches, the River Road New Testament Church. And I'm indebted to researcher Sandra Eady for bringing this report to my attention. What happens is that, that this minister, Reverend Christopher N. Ford, submitted an article to a church journal called Notes About the River Road Church and the Builder. In this article, the preacher detailed his posting to Barbados in 1921. He was Caribbean born, this Reverend Ford, apparently St. Croix, and then was sent to Barbados to launch a missionary effort there. And with the assistance of a man called Reverend Reuben Gibson of the Church of the Firstborn, then headquartered in Providence, Rhode Island, Ford was nominated and then elected by a Pentecostal organization as field superintendent for Barbados, which position he accepted. Thus it was that he arrived in Barbados, and he immediately launched a vigorous missionary activity under the banner of the Church of the Firstborn. And after 3 years, began a church building enterprise at River Road. Perhaps we can let him tell some of his story. On the screen, you'll see, he says, 3 years later, that is after his arrival, after prayer and consultation with my wife, what a wonderful image of marriage, that this minister is prepared to discuss matters with his wife. He said, we felt the Lord would have us to build a stone building, 54 feet long by 29 feet wide, after spending what money we had and the church not complete, we were forced into a debt of $1,642.94 for material and labor. Good Lord, I think many of our churches in Barbados would wish that we could build a church with that kind of money. And it eventually building cost them $7,000. One little anecdote it offers to us is that a preacher, and I'll quote this one for you, it won't put it on the screen, but I'll quote it for you. A preacher who pretended to be a friend came along and helped with a loan of $50. And shortly after, he levied on the church for the loan. But he reaped what he sowed, and God delivered us out of his hands. I mean, this is a remarkable encounter he had. Ford was assisting in this ministry by his wife. And after several years in Barbados, in 1936, without any major outside assistance, a Bishop J.H. Marshall introduced the Fords to a Reverend J.H. Ingram, who gave them first-hand information about the Church of God in Cleveland, Tennessee. And as Ford tells us, we felt clear that it was God's mind for us to become a part of this great assembly. And our union has indeed been a happy one. We are very thankful for the mission board for the way they accept us. Thus it was that the New Testament Church of God in Barbados was born. It began, as I told you, as a church of the firstborn with Pentecostal connections, but eventually it joins with the Church of God in Tennessee. And its preamble, which I think I might have that here as well, and the next thing, the preamble tells us that whereas the persons hereinafter named and other persons, inhabitants of this island, have become associated together under the name of the New Testament Church of God for the teaching and spreading of the gospel of our Lord Jesus Christ, as taught by the Church of God, the parent church in the United States of America, and elsewhere, of which the New Testament Church of God is a branch. At clause 2, it identifies some of those who were considered as leaders of the church. And these included Christopher Ford and some others there, including one, the person mentioned is Zeno Tharp, who was a member of the church in the USA, who became, in fact, its leader and its head. That is the story of the New Testament Church of God. And now, very quickly, the Church of God Reformation. I come to that. Is another group, begins around 1912. And, oh, I'm sorry, I just have to step up this a bit. The church, Reverend Ford, who began the New Testament Church, and provided a picture of the church in 1940, just not too long after it was finished. And there's a first a picture on the screen. Next slide, please. And the next slide shows you the congregation. If you look at the bottom, you might just make out 2 X's at the bottom of the gentleman and the lady in the front. And those 2 X's mark Reverend Ford and his wife. And what we note is that they are Black. They are Afro-West Indians. And that's particularly significant because if you look at most of the other churches, when the first missionaries who really arriving are in fact white missionaries. But in the case of the New Testament Church of God, Reverend Ford is an Afro-West Indian. Now we come to the Church of God Reformation. I'm not going to spend a very long time here, but it's particularly important for us to note that this church in Barbados has also begun with a Barbadian, Philip Canterbury, who comes to Barbados around 1912 to be with his mother. And he began to preach in the year of 1 1/4, and thus got a group. Eventually, he gathered enough of a group to become affiliated with the Church of God, headquartered in Indiana. So we make a decision between this group and the New Testament Church of God and their parent body in Tennessee. This gentleman, Philip Canterbury, began a ministry that led to other parts of St. Peter and other parts of Barbados, St. James, St. Andrew, so that by the 1920s, the church had a recognizable footprint in the island. At present, there are some 18 church groups affiliated with this denomination scattered all over Barbados. The initial founder group is now pastored by Pastor John Carrington and his wife, who I know quite well, and who together with the other ministers continue to build on the fire ignited by the early pioneers. And now, in the footnote to our presentation, the 2x2 movement. And most of you, as I said, will know this group as a tent gathering. Emerged of the group, which began in Ireland in the 19th century. Some people outside of the church have called its members of the church as the No-Name Church, the Christians Anonymous, the Coonyites, but we know them in Barbados as the tent gathering. The name 2x2 really relates to the practice of following the New Testament disciples of going out 2x2. What we know of this group is that it is registered in the United States as Christian conventions, and in Canada as Assemblies of Christians and Testimony of Jesus in the UK. But the members never speak of themselves in those terms. They simply call themselves friends. And any registered name is only used for legal purposes. The founder, William Irvin, had been expelled from an interdenominational group known as Faith Mission. But once he begins his move in Ireland, true today as it was yesterday, they tend to have a very low profile. They hold public evangelistic meetings in halls, tents, or other higher venues, but they don't own churches as such. And most Barbadians know very little about this group. Their members tend to be conservative in dress and general deportment, and to be law-abiding citizens. And they hold Sunday and other services in the houses of members. There are no official statistics on their membership, but they are in Barbados quite fairly represented. And in my own experience across the years, I've met several persons who claim connection or membership with the group. And in our last lap, we have groups like the Bethany Christian Church. And the reason why I have listed these here, although it's not clear that they've expanded very far in Barbados, but I list them here because I suspect that this group really emerged out of the Christian Mission Church. And I'll give you the reason why as we bring this session to a close. If you look at the Act of Incorporation of the Bethany Christian Church, and you look at the Act of Incorporation of the Christian Mission Church, the same identical wording is used in both cases. Yes, both is used in both cases. In the preamble to the Bethany Christian Church Incorporation Act, we read the same words, and it was a little curious. I had a little curiosity of the matter. Why? And then I worked out that it's possible that the legal draftsman who drafted the act was the same draftsman. The draftsman was borrowing from the earlier legislation. But then I looked through the names that were listed in the incorporation. And when I looked at the names that were listed in the incorporation of the Bethany Christian Church, I picked up an important name. There's a man called Frank Reginald Wilkins, whose name appears in the incorporation of both the Christian Mission and also in the Bethany Church. And it's on that basis that I've come to the conclusion that this is not a movement that is based on any major doctrinal issue, but there might have been a personality issue here. And out of this, we find that this church emerges. There are several other groups in Barbados, so we don't have the time this evening to get into any detail. We have the First Church of Christ Scientists, which we know began by Mary Baker Eddy in the United States of America, coming out again of the Third Great Awakening. That is incorporated in Barbados in 1941. It never seems to have achieved any major presence in Barbados, But again, it is listed among the churches that are officially recognized. And there's also an act by the House of Assembly that incorporates the act. We have not also dealt specifically with the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints or the Mormon Church, which we are very aware of, because they're more recent, and they come outside a little of our time. We have not spent time looking specifically at the Spiritual Baptists. There's an excellent work by Dr. Curtis Jacobs, which looks at the work of the Spiritual Baptists. And very recently, after the death of the founder of the Spiritual Baptist group in Barbados, Archbishop Granville, we notice there's some covers of the church there. That is a long study in its own right, and I would suggest that at some point we may wish to encourage someone who has a greater understanding of the origins of that church to speak with us on the emergence. I know quite a bit about the origin of the Spiritual Baptists in Jamaica, in Trinidad and elsewhere, St. Vincent and elsewhere. But these are some of the groups that emerged in more recent times in Barbados. There are some groups that, again, I have not mentioned Rastafari, and somebody might wonder why I would include Rastafari in a discussion about Christian churches. There are many researchers who will argue that the Rastafarian theology is a theology that builds on biblical motifs, and that a lot of its statements, while they may be applied in an Afrocentric way, a lot of the belief systems of Rastafari are in fact beliefs which are common in some respects. And I'm not talking about ganja smoking or herb. I'm talking about in many respects it is common to the Christian faith. That's where it is. So I want to end by saying that what we need to do, I believe, in as part of follow-up to these lectures, is that at some point we need to encourage an academic work which looks in some detail at the non-conformist churches and their rival in this region. There's not, in my view, adequate coverage of these churches, and I think the time has well come. So it's in that context, therefore, that I end this longish presentation to you, and invite you to listen out for the other presentations that will follow. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you very much, Professor Val, for an excellent lecture. Very comprehensive, very thorough, especially on the origins and doctrines of these churches. Excellent use of primary sources. I really enjoyed it tremendously. And I want now to open the floor for questioning. I'm sure that you have your questions, and Elena will read the questions that are in the chat. Go ahead, Elena, over to you.
Thanks, Dr. Carter. We have a question from.
Let me.
Yeah, go ahead, Elena.
Right, we have a question from Martinez. She asks, do you know what the evolution of the United Brethren in Barbados? Their return of slaves indicates that that group was here under a missionary named Christian Esberg, abode St. Philip.
If you don't notice that by
you're muted. Pedro, Professor Welch, you're muted.
You've taken, I think the questioner is asking a question about the period of enslavement. And therefore that is outside of the scope of our discussion this evening. When she's talking about United Brethren, I wish to suggest that perhaps this is a reference to the Moravian Church. And the reason why I make that point is that the official name of the Moravian Church was Unitas Fractum, UNITAS Fractum, which is Latin for United Brethren. And that will not be one of the brethren groups that we see later on developing. That's an earlier Moravian Church arrives under that title, Unitas Fractum. Essentially, my grandfather was a Moravian minister, and for many years I was associated with the Moravian Church. I presented several lectures on the history of that church, so I'm a bit familiar with that. United Brethren, I suspect that's a reference to the Moravian Church. Thank you. Next.
Okay, we have a question from David Gibbs on Facebook. He asks, how did or could the Sabbath be observed in the context 19th century Barbados labor laws?
Okay, I have to, sorry. Okay, there's a question which is asked, and this is obviously a question which has to do with the history of the Seventh-day Adventist Church in the Caribbean and in Barbados, and how could the Sabbath be observed in the context of the labor laws of the time. A very important question. Any church which did not, in fact, fit into the orthodox practices of the established church, that's the Church of England, of Barbados, is going to face difficulties. And many of those who decided to honor Saturday as Sabbath in Barbados and anywhere in the Caribbean in that period will face several difficulties. In fact, one of the early members of the Seventh-day Adventist Church in Barbados was a former teacher. I can't remember if he was a teacher in the Anglican school system or whether he's a teacher in the Methodist school system. His name was Charles Cave. And the minute that he accepted the message of the Adventist Church, he was fired from his job as a teacher. And eventually went off to the United States of America, where he did nursing first, and then completed that and went on doing medicine. And then returned to Barbados as a Seventh-day Adventist missionary and was one of the senior members in Barbados. In fact, became one of the most widely recognized doctors in Barbados. He also went off to Scotland and to the University of Edinburgh, and I think he got a fellowship there. And then practicing in Barbados and in Trinidad. It was very difficult for those early believers, and there is a lot of evidence of maltreatment, but the laws did not specifically in Barbados, did not forbid Saturday Sabbath keeping. What happened is that most places of business open on Saturdays, and even the civil service, unlike now where you end on Fridays, the civil service was open on half day on Saturdays. So there was a lot of difficulty, but one of the things that you will discover is that most of the people who joined the church in those early days were people who had relatively independent needs. And by that I mean laborers who were not tied to plantation, which is not very often, but you found some people who were independent craftsmen. You might be a blacksmith, or might be a carpenter, you might be a fisherman, you don't tie to plantation, and therefore you had more control of your time. Those are the ones who tended to become Adventists. Good.
Okay. We have a question from Dr. Ray. The question is, how long have the Shango Baptists existed in Vim, and what was the author you referenced on this subject?
Okay, let me hold on. I'll have to go back again. Okay. The question that was posed on the Shango Baptist, I did not specifically deal at length with the Shango Baptist. I just mentioned the spiritual Baptists. I hadn't cited many authors of that, but there's one author, Curtis Jacobs, who writes at length about the spiritual Baptists in Trinidad, some mention of some of the things in Barbados as well. There's a recent book, but I do not recall the authorship of that book, but it's a book written about the late Archbishop of the Spiritual Baptist in Barbados that does a historical survey of the church. If you're talking about Shango Baptist, by and large, most of the works that you will want to consider, the works published on Shango Baptist in Trinidad in particular, and you might find some references to in other Caribbean territories. I would have to check my listings to see if I can find any of the references that I have that might give you some authorship. But there's a gentleman called E.A. Simpson. And that book, this is the work that I read some 35, 40 years ago. I think it's called Jamaican Revivalist Cults. That's the name of the book. And in that book, he goes into some elaborate discussion as to the origin of the group in Jamaica, in particular. Thank you.
Okay. Okay. So we have a question from J. Harrison on Facebook. Is the Church of the Firstborn still active today? I've seen that name on some baptismal records.
Okay, let me see. Can I hear me? No? Because I haven't put back up the volume. Oh yes. Okay, I just want to confirm that you can hear me. The name Church of the Firstborn is not, as far as I understand it, still used in Barbados today. It was the name of the group which preceded the New Testament Church of God. The name of the Church of the Firstborn. So you will find some baptism records. In fact, I did not mention any detail Brother Lally, who Sandra Edie gave me a lot of information about. But Brother Lally was an itinerant missionary traveling across Barbados, and he had a tremendous reputation as a man who really made a lot of people uncomfortable. I'm told that if you knew that a gentleman was living with another lady, not his wife, in a district, and you told Brother Lally will come into the district and will preach about that lady and that gentleman. And my wife had given me a song, and to tell you the truth, I should have noted it, but it says that I think the song, a little ditty, said other preachers don't preach about this, but I can do it. I can preach anyhow. But the reason why I mention him is that one of the bits of evidence that Sandra Edie said to me relates to the fact that I think he was married in the Church of the Firstborn, or there's a baptism of one of his children in the Church of the Firstborn. So you will find reference to the Church of the Firstborn. But it doesn't exist as a denomination because Reverend Ford accepted the affiliation with the Church of God of Tennessee. And once he accepted the affiliation with the Church of God of Tennessee, then after that, there was no further reference to the Church of the Firstborn. The Church of the Firstborn apparently had an affiliation with a Pentecostalist group from the USA. Yes.
Okay, we have a question from David Gibbs on Facebook. He asks, why did some of these churches die out while others were able to survive? Thank you.
Questions asked, why did some of these churches die out while others managed to survive? I have a few theories about that. Some time ago, I spoke to the Moravian Church on the history, and I made the point that churches which have a strong missionary and evangelistic spirit tend to attract more attention and their ministry. Once we move from that early evangelistic phase and become church, now this may sound strange. Once you become church, you begin to become settled into your practice as church. And the earlier imperatives that led to your beginnings are abandoned. You get into the ritual of church. Eventually what happens in some cases that some Sometimes, once the earlier imperative that led to your existence has disappeared, then you just begin to lose the attractiveness to the general public. And as your numbers begin to fall over time, that is one of these things that signal that you're not going to last for too long. The other thing that you have to note is the importance of individuals, charismatic individuals within churches. In many cases, when you look at all the churches I mentioned, all the ones I mentioned, you will look at their beginnings and their growth. In most cases, there's an individual, very strong individual who leads the work, who has a vision for the work. And those individuals tend to gather around them significant others who can also push the work along, and that helps. But if you look very carefully at some of the churches in Barbados which have not adopted a strong evangelistic framework in their mission and message, you'll find that they still exist in many cases, but they tend to, over the years, to decline. And therefore people go, and the people who are attracted to their numbers tend to be descendants, persons, children are coming along and they go to church with their parents, that kind of thing. So that there are a lot of churches in Barbados that are declining because you only have now the children. And I'm going to mention one church. We really don't want to get too much into that, but if you look at the AME Church, church has been here for quite a long time. Most Barbadians don't even know they exist. But again, if you look at the AME Church, once its initial leadership has disappeared, most of those who continue to attend are persons who were brought up in the church, as they were. Their parents were members, and they just continue. But you need new blood. If you look in the Bible, in the Pentecostal churches, when Holmes Williams started his church there in oh good Lord, Calmarock, Upper Calmarock, sorry, Lord, I may be wrong in the location. He launched something new, and it grew. And then later on, when some members, as it were, branched off from that and launched the Abundant Life Assembly again, you know, in each case that happens. But once you settle down and lose that first drive, that first evangelistic missionary drive, it seems to me that if a church surrounds a leader and the leader dies or disappears, somebody leader leaves, then often that is the signal for the church also to die. It happens, unfortunately, but that's why there's a lot of missions. Remember, I made mention of missions very early on. Churches called missions in Barbados, and these missions were really single. They're run by a charismatic individual. They start the church, and then after many years, the church goes. Sandra Edie was mentioning a church that her uncle had started in Sugar Hill. It's empty, been empty for the last 20 years. And again, when some people die, that's it. That's a discussion I could want for the whole night. So I mean, I would just want to recommend that you know, that it's something that any of us should be able to carry on somebody else and see if we can point to some issues with some churches and, you know, see what happens. Yes.
Okay, we have one last question from Jen Bonnet.
I know who that is. That's my daughter.
Oh, okay. Do you know roughly how much the $1,000 that was borrowed to build the Mansion Stone Church is in today's dollars?
I would think that $1,000 back in 1930s, 1920s were probably amount to about probably $500,000 or more in our time. I can sort of do the comparison in the sense that in 1933, a junior civil servant would begin a salary of, let's say, less than $100 a month. I would say probably $50 a month. Now, if you get a salary of $50 a month, compare that to today, a person, a junior civil servant, will be getting a salary probably $3,000 a month. So each time, more than 10 times more. You can do a general comparison to get some idea as to what the value of money would be in turn. But I think it probably had near $500,000 now. And given what I know about, I had to build one church, so I am aware that the church is valued at more than $500,000, more than that. It took us about probably $300,000 to build a church, and given the size of the church, not all churches are not the same size, so clearly not the size of the church, etc. But I think that's probably about $500,000 into given today's building cost. More $500,000, a lot of money. Yes.
Other questions, Elena?
Yes, I'm seeing one last question here from Marcian Earth. With Jesus having been described as a Jew, do you have any ideas why more persons don't gravitate to Judaism as a means to fight for souls?
That's a very interesting question. There's an issue of anti-Semitism which has swept the world. It is rather unfortunate because Jesus himself was Jewish, and Paul was a Jew. Several others, although Paul had Roman origin as well. And it's rather unfortunate that very early in the history of Christendom, that the Jewish people became a hated group. And that anti-Semitism that you see that the Germans practiced under the Nazis, that anti-Semitism has a long history. If you look at the development of anti-Semitism, it really goes back to the fact that the Jews are blamed for the crucifixion of Jesus Christ. And therefore, once they're blamed for the crucifixion of Jesus Christ, of course, it's the Romans who crucified Jesus. But the Jews obviously are to blame too, in that they made a choice. But the early church began with Jews. The early Christian church began with a Jewish church, by and large. Even when on the day of Pentecost, when the first instance of tongue speaking arose, the fact remains that that early church was made up of Jewish people and proselytes who had been converted to the religion. Now, today, I don't think people tend to identify with the Jewish people, mainly because of the anti-Semitism which still fills many of us. But there's some Christian churches now, particularly those of what are known in America as the religious right, which have come to adopt Israel as being a people blessed by God. And there's a strong movement afoot towards identifying with Israel. But that identification with Israel does not really extend to identifying with Judaism and the Jewish religion per se. Is more identified an attempt to see Jewish people as in need of conversion and saving. So that's basically what it is. That's a discussion again that can go on forever, because there's so much in it, you know. But thanks for the question, nevertheless. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Welch, for an excellent presentation. I want to thank you for taking the time to research, to present, to find images, especially those images relating to I think it's the Christian mission in Panama. And I like that type of research, looking at how the church is moving out as well from Barbados into the Eastern Caribbean, and of course into Panama. I want to thank you for spending this time with us. And I also want to thank Mrs. Pinder, who is manager of our platform and who's fielding the questions, etc., and who's here very early to make sure that everything is on stream. Thank you, Mrs. Pinder. Thank Leshid as well, who works behind the scenes. She's our marketing officer. Also, thanks to the University of West Indies Department of History for their work in this series. I want to thank the audience for joining us, for staying with us for over 2 hours, for nearly 2 hours, and of course, for making comments, very incisive comments, and fielding questions. Very good questions were asked and good answers given. So all in all, I think we've had a very good lecture tonight on the mission churches. It is true that Professor Welch did not mention all, and he could not have mentioned all, but he gave us a good synopsis of at least about 13 or so, and zeroing in on the origins of these churches, and of course how they expanded into the 20th century. So Professor Welch, thank you so much. Audience, thank you. Our next lecture is next week, June the 9th, where Dr. Derek Murray will present on African spirituality and religion in the Caribbean from slavery to the present. And the chairperson for that is Dr. Curtis Jacobs. You've heard his book mentioned today by Professor Welch. He is chairing that lecture. Again, I thank you. I pray that you would get home safe, Professor Welch and Elena, and all the other museum staff. Please get home safely, and we pray God's blessings upon you. And good night from me. Have a wonderful evening. That's it from me. Bye-bye, everyone.